The smooth mahogany table that was supposed to hold our wedding tasting menu instead held a thick, cream-colored envelope. Sliding past my water glass with the sickening friction of a weapon being unholst, my fiancée didn't look nervous. She looked like a predator who had spent 14 months training a sheep to love the shears. She actually smiled, taking a slow sip of red wine. While 6 of her closest friends and a corporate attorney stared at me, waiting for my knees to buckle. They thought they had trapped me. They thought I was the gullible small-town contractor who'd sign anything to keep a beautiful woman happy. They had no idea that the moment that folder touched the tablecloth, the wedding was over, and my real work had just begun. To understand how deep the blade went that night, you have to understand who April was, or at least who she pretended to be. I met April 2 years ago at a commercial renovation site. I owned a boutique residential and light commercial contracting firm. It was work I'd built from the ground up after 10 years of swinging hammers, saving every dime, and living off canned food while my friends were out partying. I wasn't flashy. I drove a 10-year-old truck, wore work boots that had seen better days, and spent my weekends covered in drywall dust. April was a senior marketing associate for a mid-sized commercial firm. She was polished, articulate, and wore tailored blazers that looked like they cost more than my monthly mortgage. When she took an interest in me, I thought I'd struck gold. When I bought my grandmother's diamond ring back from a family dispute and proposed to April on a terrace overlooking the city, she cried. She hugged me so tight I could feel her heart racing against my chest, or so I thought. Looking back, the red flags weren't red. They were glowing neon. But when you're in love, you look at red flags through rose-colored glasses, and they just look like flags. April slowly started pushing me out of her high society circle. When her friends threw dinner parties, she'd subtly suggest I skip them because I looked so exhausted from the job site. When I offered to pay for things, she'd accept without hesitation. But when it came to her expenses, she was curiously broke despite making a great salary. I paid her credit card debt twice under the guise of helping us start clean. I bought her a lease on a new car because a contractor's truck didn't fit the image of her social circle. I thought I was being a supportive partner. I thought we were building a life. The rehearsal preview dinner was supposed to be a small, intimate gathering at an upscale restaurant downtown. But when I arrived, the private dining room was already buzzing. April was sitting at the head of the table, flanked by her sister, her roommate's husband, and a few other friends. And then there was the man at the end of the table. He was wearing a charcoal suit that screamed 4-figure billable hours. Next to his hand sat a pristine leather portfolio. He was sipping sparkling water with lime, looking at me with the cold, calculating eyes of an actuary, assessing a car crash. April tilted her head and chirped that they thought it made sense to handle some administrative details tonight. Somewhere relaxed where they could talk as a group, as a family. That was when the man in the charcoal suit unzipped his portfolio, pulled out a thick document enclosed in a heavy cream folder, and slid it across the white tablecloth. It stopped right between my shrimp cocktail and my glass of ice water. Embossed across the top in gold foil was the name of the most predatory family law firm in the city. I looked up at April. She was smiling a tight, triumphant little curl of her lips. Her lawyer smoothly explained that it was a prenuptial agreement. Given the disparity in our backgrounds and the potential trajectory of April's career, her family felt it was prudent to establish clear boundaries regarding asset division and future earnings before we entered into a legal marriage. I asked April softly why we were doing this when we had agreed 6 months ago that we didn't need one. April took another sip of her wine with total condescension, saying we were adults now and it's just what responsible people in their tax bracket do. Her sister jumped in with a razor-thin smile, saying I ran a small labor business and construction was volatile, while April was rising in the corporate world. So this simply protected her future. When I opened the folder, the terms weren't just unfair. They were insultingly predatory. According to the contract, April retained 100% of any joint property purchased during the marriage if it dissolved, even if my company provided the physical labor or capital for renovations. In the event of a divorce, I would be required to vacate our home, which was in my name, but which she demanded I deed into a joint trust within 72 hours. And to top it off, there was a bizarre financial penalty structure for me if I failed to maintain standard emotional and financial support. They had brought a lawyer to a dinner, surrounded me with her friends as an audience, and presented me with an ultimatum. They thought the setting would force me to comply to avoid a scene. They thought my pride would make me nod, sign, and try to fix it later in private. They had completely miscalculated who they were dealing with. I didn't yell. I didn't throw my drink. I took a deep breath, closed the cream-colored folder, and set it neatly back on the attorney's side of the table. Saying I needed a moment to read it properly, I looked around that table at her sister who was smirking, at her friends who were watching me like a laboratory rat, and at attorney who was already checking his watch. And finally, I looked at April. I didn't see love in her eyes. I saw calculation. She genuinely believed she had managed me. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 weeks prior, my firm had been officially awarded a massive $12 million municipal revitalization contract. I hadn't told April yet because I was waiting for our actual wedding rehearsal to surprise her with the news, and to reveal that I had bought us a historic home, fully paid for in cash from my company's growth fund. I was worth significantly more than April, her sister, and her attorney combined. But because I didn't wear tailored suits to Sunday brunch, she assumed I was penniless. My heart didn't break in that private dining room. It hardened into concrete. I stood up, saying I needed to wash my hands before dinner arrived. I walked out of the room, down the hallway, and pulled out my phone to make 3 calls. First, to my corporate attorney, instructing her to shred the deed transfer paperwork for the house immediately and revoke April's secondary signing authorization on my business credit accounts. Second, to my locksmith, ordering him to meet me at my house in 30 minutes to rekey every exterior door and override the smart lock codes. Third, to my site foreman, telling him to take a truck to my house right away, clear out every stitch of high-end clothing, bags, and personal belongings that belonged to April, pack them into boxes, and move them to a climate-controlled storage unit. When I walked back into the private dining room 10 minutes later, the appetizers had arrived and everyone was celebrating what they clearly assumed was my silent submission. The attorney tapped his pen and asked if I was ready to sign off on the terms. I stood at the end of the table, resting my hands on the back of my chair, and said I'd given it some thought and that it was time to talk business. April chuckled nervously and told me to sit down because I was making a scene. I reached across the table, grabbed the cream folder, picked up the attorney's custom pen, and looked at the final signature page. Then, with 2 swift, deliberate motions, I tore the entire document straight down the middle. The sound of thick paper ripping in half echoed off the walls like a gunshot. The attorney's mouth dropped open. Her sister gasped. I took the 2 halves, folded them together, tore them again, and dropped the shredded pieces directly into the center of the seafood ice tray, soaking them in melting slush. April shrieked, asking if I was insane. I looked directly into her eyes and told her that no, I was exercising my rights, and the wedding was officially canceled. Her sister started shouting that I was embarrassing her, but I cut her off, telling her that they wanted a doormat, but now they could pay for their own dinner because I was leaving. April stood up in a panic, grabbing my arm, begging to talk outside and claiming it was just a formality. I looked down at her hand on my arm, then looked at her left ring finger. I told her softly that before I left, I believed she was wearing something that belonged to my family. She gasped, saying I had given it to her. I reminded her that the ring belonged to my grandmother, that I spent 5 years hunting it down and buying it back, and that it represented loyalty and sacrifice. 3 things she knew nothing about when she refused to take it off in front of her friends. I leaned in and gave her 10 seconds before I called the police for theft of non-marital property, complete with the original purchase receipt in my possession. Her hands trembled violently. Tears of rage and humiliation welled in her eyes as she pulled at the ring, ripping it free from her finger and slamming it onto the table. I picked up the ring, wiped it clean, slipped it safely into my pocket, and told them to enjoy their meal because I had already canceled my card with the front desk. And dinner was on her attorney. The fallout over the next 48 hours was swift. When April arrived at my house 2 hours later, screaming and pounding on the door, she found brand new high-security locks and a key taped to an envelope on the porch leading to her storage locker, along with a formal notice of trespass. The next morning, when she went to use her leased car, she discovered the vehicle had been voluntarily surrendered back to the dealership, since the primary account holder, me, had terminated the agreement. She was forced to take a rideshare to work. When she got to her office, her managing director called her in. The news of my company's $12 million municipal project had hit the press, and her boss asked if she could leverage her relationship with me to secure their firm a piece of the marketing contract. April had to sit in her boss's office and explain that not only was the engagement over, but she had been served with a legal cease and desist after attempting to strong-arm me with a prenup. Fearful of being associated with a legal mess that could alienate the city's biggest new developer, her firm quietly placed her on administrative leave. A few months later, I attended the groundbreaking ceremony for my new project, standing beside the mayor in my work boots and a tailored suit I bought myself. As for April, she moved back in with her family, spending her savings trying to settle the debt she'd accumulated on the credit cards I was no longer paying off. People often ask me if I regret making a scene that night at the restaurant. My answer is always the same: I didn't make a scene. I just turned the lights on, and the cockroaches ran for cover. Never let anyone make you feel small just because you choose to carry yourself with humility.